Joining us from Capitol Hill is Congressman John Delaney, Democrat from Maryland. Before entering Congress, Congressman Delaney founded two companies that eventually went public. He's also the first major Democrat to declare for the 2020 presidential race. Congressman, great to have you again. So you've just heard Congressman Scalise. If that vote comes to you this year, would you support making the individual cuts permanent?
I have no idea, because tax bills are big, complicated pieces of legislation. I didn't support the first tax proposal plan that obviously got passed here in the Congress because I thought it was bad policy. There were certain aspects of it that I supported, but I think in general we could have done a much better job with that tax reform proposal. It could have been more responsive to the problems we have in the economy, and it could have been done in a way that was more fiscally responsible across the long term. It sounds like what Whip Scalise was talking about was trying to do something for political purposes, the way he described that, which is not how I think about tax policy. So I can't really comment because I don't know what they're talking about, to be honest with you.
Having said that, individual tax cuts being permanent would help the American public. That's been the key criticism from the Democrats of not supporting this package.
Right. Well, because the corporate rates were permanent and the individual rates weren't, which I think a lot of us, among many objections we had to this, we didn't see why that was fair. I think in general the corporate reform wasn't done right in this bill. I was totally in favor of lowering the corporate tax rate to make our country more competitive, and I was particularly focused on fixing the international tax system, which was the most kind of troublesome part of the tax code. But I think in general they kind of overshot it. The business community for a decade had lobbied for a 25% corporate tax rate to make the code more competitive. They lowered it all the way to 21%. That cost $400 billion. I would have much rather seen that money go towards making the individual rates permanent or doing an infrastructure plan, for example. So I thought in general it wasn't a good bill, and I don't know what their version 2.0 is going to be, to be honest with you.
Congressman, fair enough, but that's really water under the bridge, isn't it? The corporate part is done. It's permanent. So as a practical matter for you as a congressman and also for a candidate for president in 2020, how can you stand up and say we're going to take away the tax cuts for individuals? That's not going to be a very popular position.
I don't want to do that, right? But nothing is permanent, right? That's why we have a Congress, and that's why we have legislatures. We're supposed to do the right thing for the American people. So I think if they want to reopen the tax discussion, I think we should do that, and we should do something smart, because, I do support making a bunch of these individual tax cuts permanent, but I also support the notion that we shouldn't be leaving an immoral debt to the next generation of this country, right? Because I think the future generation in about 20 years is going to look around and realize that work has entirely changed because of automation and artificial intelligence. They're going to see people living longer, which is a blessing because of life sciences advances, but it's going to put huge strains on our deficit. They're going to see an entirely new security risk based on kind of weaponized artificial intelligence, and they're going to need to make investments to kind of deal with those things. And what we're doing right now is putting them in a position where they'll have no financial flexibility. So I don't think anything is quite permanent. When you bring something to the floor of the House and you want to make certain individual tax cuts permanent, which I totally be in favor of, I think we should look at other things to try to pay for this and do something that's more responsive to the problems we have in the economy.
So goodness knows that's a great point. We are spending an awful lot of our children's and our grandchildren's money, and a lot of people, particularly in Wall Street, are really concerned about that. Bond markets are concerned about it.
Rightly so.
But does that really lie in the mouth of Democrats? I mean, apparently the deficit hawks have gone away from the Republicans, but the Democrats have never been known to be very frugal with the money. Let's be honest.
Look, I think for a generation we have been imprudent with the resources that we have in this amazing nation of ours. And that old campsite rule, you're supposed to leave the place better than you found it, which is the way I've tried to live my life with every institution or organization I've been involved in. We're not doing that here. We're not doing that in Washington. We're fundamentally leaving, in my opinion, two very large debts to the future generation. First, a fiscal debt, and secondly, quite frankly, kind of an environmental debt, because we're not doing anything against climate change, which some future generation is going to have to deal with, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So we're very short-sighted, and one of the problems I have with the administration is it's somewhat backward-looking. And really, if you talk to people in business, if you talk to people in academia, if you talk to people outside of government, they're obsessed with how the world is changing because of technology and innovation, things that are incredibly positive, but they're having a profound effect on our society and our economy. And we're going to need to make some investments in this economy and in institutions that support people so that they're prepared for this new economy. And we're not putting ourselves in a position to do that, and that is so frustrating for someone like me, who actually, as a business person, as an entrepreneur, I've always been very focused on the future and how things are changing and how you prepare for it.
As a business person, how do you feel about regulations in the Senate yesterday passing legislation to roll back Dodd-Frank? That will ease some of the burden on regional and community banks.
And, you know, listen, I'm supportive of alleviating regulations on community banks. As someone who started 2 companies, took them public on the New York Stock Exchange, I think my first company, I was the youngest CEO on the New York Stock Exchange. Regulations can be very damaging to business, and I think the Democratic Party hasn't kind of leaned in enough to the notion of all these duplicative regulations that exist in our economy and how we need to clean those up if we want to have an entrepreneurial kind of startup-oriented economy. Because let's face it, regulations disproportionately hurt smaller business relative to bigger business. Bigger businesses can hire the people to deal with them. Smaller businesses often find themselves in a very kind of non-competitive or uncompetitive place because of regulations. So I'm totally in favor of kind of getting rid of regulations, looking at regulations to make sure they're doing what they're intended to do. But we have to also be careful about not kind of going overboard. And I worry the administration will do that and kind of take away a lot of protections to consumers that are, in fact, important. So I think striking the right balance on this is really, really important.
Okay, many thanks, Congressman. Really good of you to share your time with us today. That's Congressman